Kia ora koto katoa. Welcome to CARE's Activist in Residence program. This week we are so excited to have with us the Ngati Poro Wahine activist, Tina Ngata. Tina is an environmental rights defender, an indigenous activist, and a leader who has shaped much of the conversation on indigeneity and climate justice. I'm particularly interested in learning from Tina the ways in which our analysis of white supremacy, climate colonialism, and indigenous rights intersect with each other. This week, Tina and I are going to spend quite a bit of time talking about the intersections of Maori and migrant struggles in resisting white supremacy. So, such a delight to have you with us, Tina. Welcome.
Oh, tēnā koe, kia ora. Thank you very much for the offer to come and sit and talk about these huge issues, the big monsters as we call them, and look at how we can tackle them.
Kia ora. So, Tina, I wanted to begin by asking you a little bit about your activist journey. Now, that's a very big picture question, but if you want to give us a brief insight into what got you started on this journey.
Sure. I mean, I should say, my life actually has been shaped by social justice and injustice. My father was a policeman during the Dawn raids, and he actually left the police force as a part of those decisions that were made, resulted in him walking away and also exposing a lot of the harmful policies that led to those types of decisions as well. And so we moved around a lot after that, but also, that came with consequences, it came with threats, it came with danger towards our whānau as well. So, response to social injustice and responding to social injustice really shaped my childhood in fundamental ways. My academic kind of aspect kicked in to those ideas and beliefs around social justice when I came here to Massey. And so I had done some travel around the world, and I saw how important it was for people to be able to, particularly Indigenous groups, to be able to hold on to their cultural expressions as a form of well-being and as a form of healing as well. And so I was really interested in learning about how, who we are as people feeds into our idea of well-being and the roles of identity. And so I came to Massey, and I studied at Te Pūtahi Ātoi. At that time, Mason Jury was still running Te Hoi Nukuroa, which is a study of Māori households. It was a longitudinal study of Māori households. And I was really proud to work in that study. They had said in the 90s that it was impossible to do a longitudinal study on Māori households. We're too flippant, we're too mobile, we don't engage in science, we're unscientific people. And so, Te Hoi Nukuroa is a longitudinal study which bucked all of the trends in terms of the households it was able to retain in this longitudinal study. After 25 years, it still had a significant amount of households on the study. And so thousands of households. And I spent a lot of my undergrad and then postgrad time interviewing those households. And I got a really strong appreciation, not just for Tā Mason's approach to our broad understanding of well-being from an Indigenous perspective, but also the diversity of the Māori experience. And that contrasted so significantly with this really limited idea of what it is to be Māori. And so I became really impassioned at that point around, supporting Te Ao Māori and living and fighting for our rights as Māori through that journey. The other thing that I think I learnt over that time through Tā Mason and observation of him was just how powerful the facts around colonialism are. And even if you were to take all of the emotion out of that discussion, which it can be a really enraging discussion, if you were to take all of the emotion out of it, the facts themselves are powerfully emotive, just in and of themselves. And so, the things that I learnt, the bare facts that I learnt through his writings and his teachings, really drove me into a space of wanting to address and respond to those issues about how difficult it was for us to live as Māori, not just be Māori and exist as Māori, but to live as Māori as well on our own whenua. And so yeah, that was kind of that was my journey. And then after Tā Mason and working at Massey University, I moved to Wellington and then met Moana Jackson as well, who became a great mentor for me, and also really helped to shape my ideas around what Indigenous justice looks like. And I think that has been a real, what we call the toka tū moana. It has been the unshakable kind of cornerstone, I guess, of my journey, is how important it is to articulate justice really clearly, because if we are not articulating it for ourselves, it will be articulated within very limited parameters by our oppressors. And so the clear articulation of Indigenous justice, so that you can set your sights on the horizon and advance towards it, is quite fundamental and remains a really fundamental part of my journey. And I think when I came to learn about the doctrine of discovery, which has really dominated a lot of my work, it was really within this idea of shaping and clearly articulating what justice is. And so the doctrine of discovery is, this long-standing human rights violation. And when I first heard about it, how it was described is that as the driver of all Indigenous dispossession, I came to learn that it is the story of, the global slave trading industry, and I came to learn that it was also the codifying of racism, and that it set in place a context of global economic injustice. And I thought, wow, this is actually really important for being able to clearly frame what injustice looks like, so that you can clearly articulate justice and the destination of justice as well, and the parameters for it. So that's a bit of my journey.
What is so beautiful in your retelling of this journey is going back to your childhood and talking about your father. How important is the personal in activist work?
The personal?
Yeah.
Oh yes, I believe it's really important. I have a really strong belief in, structural integrity, what we call structural integrity. When I first learned about, for instance, the injustice of plastic pollution, for me, in my approach and what I learned, it was really important that I not just, if I was going to take a stand against plastic pollution, that I not just go out and campaign on it. I needed to understand how I personally contribute to the problem. So I undertook a year of no plastic. I would not purchase plastic. It was an abysmal failure. An abysmal failure. The first month that I tried it, because I thought, okay, if I do have to, I'm going to save it, and I'm going to be accountable to myself. Every month I'm going to weigh the amount of plastic that I've bought. Well, the first month I just saw all of this plastic, but it was, I had to become aware of it, and I had to face up to it. and become personally accountable to it in order to understand my role in the system and to almost geolocate myself within the system, within the systemic problem, so that I could start to chart my pathway out of it. If I can't chart my pathway out of a problem, who am I to ask anybody to follow me or to expect anybody to follow me? Or even if I don't, to allow anybody to follow me if I can't chart my own pathway out of it. And so for me, structural integrity in terms of your own approach to a problem is about understanding, where you feature in it and your journey through that, even going back to your childhood as well. So you must personalize it in order to not be a shell. There's nothing, this is a very fragile structure. If you're only going to be a shell with nothing internal, that's a very fragile structure. If you want something that's, going to be robust, that is going to last the journey, particularly for difficult journeys, for, really gnarly issues, it's going to be a long journey, it's going to be a hard journey. You need structural integrity. You're only going to do that when you're critically self-analytical.
You're talking about sort of a practice of critical reflexivity,
yes.
if you will,
Yes.
right? And continually reflecting on one's embeddedness within these structures of power, which also brings an interesting question, going back to your narrating of the story of your father, which is sort of this critical analysis of our own complicity within these colonial structures vis-a-vis our capacity to resist these structures.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, he really set the standard for me. And, having been a part of the New Zealand police and then seeing these things that he deeply, deeply disagreed with and trying in multiple ways to shift that from within the system, and then realizing that there comes a time where you have to walk away. And then how do you walk away? If you're walking away from injustice, do you walk away in a way that, allows that injustice to be perpetuated? Or do you walk away in a way that leaves a mark and tries to create change? So when my father walked away, he took everything that he knew and the evidence of it and went to the media and exposed a lot of it. And that came with a significant price for us as a family. As I said, it came with threats, it came with, a lot of issues for us as a family. But he did that because he really believed that it was the right thing to do, and he had a really strong adherence to ideas of fairness and justice. So I think that just at a really early stage of my life set a standard for your own personal values. And of course it's become really relevant again through the recent apology for the Dawn raids, and again even just in recent months the return of Dawn raids, hearing that there are more Dawn raids being carried out, and now it's becoming a political issue with the national government saying that they wish to retain the right to be able to carry out Dawn raids, even though we know that these things have had long-standing intergenerational consequences of harm. And I wanted to say, particularly around this idea of, personalising the political, for the big issues around countering racism and white supremacy, addressing climate change, corporate political activity. These are big issues. They're also big foes. It's frustrating. You see a lot of people burn out. I've seen a lot of people pass away from fatigue, from these issues. So it's a big fight that you're undertaking, and you're not going to make it if you are only going to take an intellectual approach. It can't just be your head that you apply to this. You have to really apply your heart. And I think, you have to really believe in what you're doing and approach this with your heart and your head and your legs and your hands. If you want to see this through, it's going to take nothing less than that, because the forces that we're up against are centuries in the making, and they are well resourced and deeply entrenched. And so, you know, the personalising of it, you have to be able to lay your head down on the pillow at the end of the day and believe in what you're doing, and feel okay about the stand that you're taking, and know that you're not just doing this as an intellectual exercise, but you're doing it with your whole being as a service to future generations. I think it takes nothing less than that in order to be able to stand up to the forces that we are standing up to.
And you know, Tina, this is so beautiful, because as I was reflecting on what you were sharing about your dad's story, it also meant risks to all of you as Fana, and the kind of courage it must take to cultivate the habits of speaking out against a deeply entrenched, powerful structure that is going to mobilize the forces it has at its hands to silence that voice. And then I see that courage in you, in the way in which you continue to speak up and speak out and write. I find your writing to be so powerful, but embodied in that is courage. So as you're talking about, you know, bringing the body in to the struggle, if you will, with the heart, the mind, the hands and the legs. Could you talk a little bit about how one cultivates the courage? Because, you know, there are times when sort of the heat gets really high, the volume of heat. I feel scared, you know, I feel scared for my Fana. I feel scared that my children's images will be on some digital platform, you know. So how does one reconnect with that courage, but also seek support to sustain the struggle against these powerful forces?
I think there are two parts to that. For me, I can only speak to how I approach it and what drives me into that space. And one is having a clear understanding of the end game of these forces that we are standing up to. Nothing concerns me greater than the end game that these groups see, which is, you know, for white supremacists, the ultimate end game is the annihilation of everything that we are, where you are only allowed to exist if you are existing as a white person, as a European person, and a shell of yourself. And when you understand the harm, the mortality that comes with that, that strikes fear into me, much more than standing up and speaking the truth to somebody in the here and now, is seeing the trajectory of where that mindset leads to, the harm that it leads to. So in order to avoid that fearful outcome, I'm more than willing to stand up in spite of the fear. And then I believe the other part of it is seeing that some things are bigger than you singularly. And so for me, you know, some of these larger issues, even if I don't see a change, the end game that I'm fighting for in my lifetime, and I don't believe I will, at least I know that with the time that I have had here, I've contributed towards a better trajectory. And, you know, if you bury me, I don't know how to say this in a nice way. Bury me, like this is and actually it was a female elder that I heard that she goes, well, if you're going to bury me with one finger in the air. I was like, right on, man. And so, you know, just do what you can with the time that you have towards what you believe is the right thing, even if it's just you, even if it's only you. If you have spent that time to deeply wānanga with yourself and you truly believe inside of yourself that this is the right thing for humanity, for yourself, for your future, for your children, your grandchildren, your people, your community, then that is the thing you must do, right? Regardless of what that means for you personally, that is the thing that you must do. So for me, that those approaches, those are the things that really drive me. I don't know about the word courage, but those are the things that drive me to stand up when I need to stand up, regardless of the context. And that comes with understanding also the lineage that I come from, my own whakapapa. Whakapapa back to my ancestors and the trajectory of that lineage forward to future generations as well. And what is my service to that line of descent and ascent?
That is so powerful, especially connecting to your idea of indigenous justice that you were talking about earlier. Aotearoa feels, I don't want to turn to exceptionalism per se, but feels special in some ways in the fight against white supremacy. To me, as Tawiwi, because of Te Tiriti, it seems to offer a kind of spirit that looks back and looks forward in offering a register for resistance. Do you have any thoughts on that, and sort of in terms of thinking through indigenous justice in a global context?
Sure. So the global story of indigenous justice and injustice is really a part of this discussion that we have around the doctrine of discovery that took, European ideas of supremacy and Eurocentric, Anglocentric ideas of supremacy and then implanted them systemically around the world and built not just domestic systems around the world, but transnational and international systems of trade and policy, and even the creation of borders and ideas around the movement of people. So it globalized these notions of European and Anglo supremacy. And when that arrived on our shores, we have our own specific story around that. So that arrived on our shores. And a part of that story is the development of Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And I think if there's a really important report, Waitangi Tribunal report, for people to read, it's the Paparahi o Te Raki report, the Northland claim, because that speaks quite powerfully to the context of the drafting of Te Tiriti and what a treaty actually is. So, we have to understand, what is a treaty? A treaty is an agreement signed by two sovereign nations. So there's one learning. We obviously had sovereignty in order to be able to sign up to Te Tiriti. The second question is, was the treaty a treaty of cession? Well, the greatest of experts on this matter have already gathered and deliberated and collected evidence around that and have come to the considered conclusion that no, it was not a treaty of cession. But they've also spoken quite powerfully around what it was that our ancestors believed that they were signing up to and the future that they envisioned through that process. So I think Te Tiriti o Waitangi is a really powerful tool, if we allow it to be, can be a really powerful tool to counter the forces of European imperialism. That was the vision of our ancestor signatories on Te Tiriti o Waitangi. That is what they believed could happen when it was applied. Now, here's the thing. Who has been responsible for its application and who has been responsible for its violation throughout time? From the moment of its signing, Tau Māori have had to drag our treaty partner back to the treaty time and time again to remind them of their responsibility. And every bit of treaty progress that we've experienced in this nation has come through Te Ao Māori. And, you know, Te Treaty, as much as it's called a Māori concept and a Māori issue, it's actually the people who it created rights for were not Māori. We already had rights by virtue of our whakapapeha genealogy and our presence here. We already had rights. Created rights for tauiwi, created rights for non-Māori. And it said to them that, yes, you can make your home here, but not at the expense of the people whose home it already is. And these are the standards by which you may call this place home. And so it's become a Māori issue because Māori have played such an important and consistent role in holding the Crown to account for those standards by which tauiwi may call this place home. And even holding them to account to the standards by which they may exercise or express kawanatanga. Because when you consider what was happening at that time, Parliament, of course, when we signed Te Tiriti, Parliament did not exist. That was not within our framing of kawanatanga. Kawanatanga was a completely new word at the time. And the only kawana that we had was Hobson, right? Hobson had a rangatira. The rangatira was Queen Victoria. And so you have to look at Te Tiriti to say, okay, so we've accorded kawanatanga here, and rangatiratanga rests with ngā hapu o Aotearoa. And so in terms of what that means for the perceptions of what those 505 signatories on Te Tiriti o Waitangi, which accorded kawanatanga to Hobson or to Queen Victoria, she got kawanatanga, and we got rangatiratanga, and what that meant in terms of the agreement. So off the back of that agreement came the 1852 New Zealand Constitution Act, which enabled settlers to establish a government, a parliament that was never a part of what was agreed to in Te Tiriti. And then from there, from that parental violation of Te Tiriti, come all of the subsequent violations. And over time, our job has been to consistently bring them back again to go, now this is a violation, now this is a violation, this is what honouring Te Tiriti looks like, this is a... And so we've done that work so often and so consistently that Te Tiriti o Waitangi has come to be seen as a Māori issue. Because we've been the protectors and the defenders of it for so long.
You know, part of this seems like, and going back to doctrine of discovery, sort of the deployment of racist discursive architectures, if you will, to deny the long histories of science, of governmentality, of rule that already exist and have been in existence. So it seems like it is in that backdrop then that there is this articulation of democracy, and that we see being deployed even in the contemporary context. You know, the kind of rhetoric, one person, one vote. You know, which fundamentally seems to be based upon this racist denial of Te Tiriti. So how does one then challenge that kind of racist discourse, especially when that is being mainstreamed by political parties here in Aotearoa?
Yeah. So, you know, I think that the discussion around the doctrine of discovery is so important in this space because, again, it allows us to articulate justice and also to articulate political justice, but it also tells the story of how these Eurocentric and Anglocentric ideas became deeply embedded in ideas of intellectual theory and in science as well. And, you know, you have a look at what was once justified through ideas of Christian domination, because the full name is the doctrine of Christian discovery, And this was a very, at the time, Christianity was a very powerful vessel for carrying, this racist discourse around the world, this idea of Christian supremacy. And then with the advent of the Age of Enlightenment, a lot of these people were already by that point deeply invested in these racist economies of slave trade and indigenous dispossession. And so in shifting across to intellectual justifications, they created faux science. Now, some of the science is terrible. It's, talking about the most effective ways to whip a black person because they have very thick skin, and even these ideas about Maori being thick-skinned, and it came through in even some of our vaccination discussions, the ideas that people of colour naturally have thicker skin, and so you need a longer needle to be able to pierce their skin. So these are surviving racist ideas that have their roots in the idea that you can whip a person for longer because they have thicker skin and they're made to be slaves, and they're destined to be slaves. So there's these legacies of intellectual racism that come through this story, and they operate with the same end in mind, to justify power systems that protect privilege, economic privilege, for particular groups, for European groups and Anglo-centric groups. And so, the telling of this story of the doctrine of discovery, being very clear around how that progressed into intellectual theory, and how that intellectual theory and the role of research and science and the justification of political systems within the policy sphere, within the policy cycle, the way in which science works to justify maintaining these things, channeling of resources and channeling of money and power. So when you're really clear about that, that is when you can start to clearly articulate to people what justice looks like. And then you can start to shift the trajectory, because there is a general leaning towards justice within humanity. You have to believe in that, otherwise, just go home. So you have to believe that humanity does have a leaning for justice. So you have to be able to clearly articulate that justice, which means we must look back at the pathway we've come from and identify the pathway of injustice that we have come through, so that we can see where its legacy rests today in our systems, and start to unpick that legacy and re-embed trajectories of justice. So telling that story is really important, particularly so that you can understand how it has influenced our political systems, and also so that you can develop an imagination around what a new political system might look like. I talk about the harm of particularly capitalist democracy and market democracies, which is what we live under. People look at what we're living under right now and they go, well, that's democracy. Well, no, that is capitalist and market democracy that looks to allocate resources based upon an idea of, social entitlement. So what is that social entitlement? Well, that's grown out of this racist intellectual tradition that comes out of the doctrine of Christian discovery. So let's open our imaginations, and please don't, when I'm talking to somebody, please don't bore me with this idea that if I'm not into capitalist democracy, I must be here for dictatorship. Come on, let's use our imagination. There are many different ways to look at this, and I think if you have a look at Matike Mai, the report that was put out in 2016, that envisions at least 6 different models of how we might centre te tiriti in our political makeup, is really relevant and important discussion today, because this discussion around co-governance is a co-option again of political, what our political justice might look like in Aotearoa if we were to centre te tiriti in our political frameworks. What does that mean for how we share power, I think a lot of the discussions around co-governance work on this premise that we should all hold hands and have a 50-50 split down the middle and make decisions about everything together, but actually that's not what Te Tiriti was about. Te Tiriti clearly outlined that there are some areas that should rest with the governor and the government, and there are other areas that should rest with the rangatira, ngā rangatira o ngā hapu o Aotearoa. And so that is what was signed up to. Those were the standards that were signed up to, and so that's the real discussion. And I do believe that you can have a democratic system of sorts, but I also think you really just need to develop a political system that works towards those ideals of justice, whatever it looks like. Let's not get caught up in the terminology, particularly terminology that has grown out of an intellectual framework rooted in oppression anyway.
And I suppose that a part of this also is recognizing that this capitalist structure of democracy is built upon the fundamental denial of democratic rights to the colonized peoples.
Absolutely, and you can see that it is eating itself. You can see that. You have a look at, supposed democratic nations around the world, particularly ones who have had interference from the harbinger of democracy, the United States, where they have come in to apply democracy.
Democracy promotion.
Democracy promotion. It's been incredibly violent and is still now incredibly violent, where they have interfered to apparently establish democracy. It's been very violent and has not at all resulted in well-being for those communities or for those people. Has created systems of corruption, of huge corruption. And so you look around at elections in Brazil, in Colombia, in Mexico, in the United States, the insurrection riots, all within capitalist democratic frameworks, all violent spaces as well. And so, it's a complete falsehood that these ideals of democracy result in well-being or equal well-being and justice for communities. You have to look at that. And it's getting worse. And it's getting worse, and you can see the violence is getting worse. So it's going to consume itself anyway. So I think we're just very fortunate here in Aotearoa that we do have the framework of Te Tiriti as a foundation block upon which to envision a new way of moving forward as a nation.
And what you're saying is also making me think about disinformation, sort of being the fundamental infrastructure, if you will, of the empire and democracy promotion. Like you think Operation Iraqi Freedom and weapons of mass destruction, or
Yes, because they need narratives to justify, colonial fictions. And this is what I wrote my book about, was around challenging colonial fictions, because they require these fictions to justify themselves. This is the importance of hero making, the importance of justness and righteousness in your story. If you want to build a movement, you have to have people really believe in that movement. And so you need to construct these legitimizations around it. And so there's a couple of things in there. One is that, you should deny people the ability to be able to critically analyze a story for themselves. And so there's quite a bit of work that goes into denying people critically and analytical tools to be able to do that themselves. And then two, you need to construct a very seductive narrative as well. So you can see in disinformation narratives that there's often, this kind of sub-narrative of having people believe that they're in on a secret, that they're special, they're in this kind of special group. And when they believe that they're in this special group that is privy to information that other people don't have, this is a form of seduction, is making people believe that you matter, that you're special, that you're a part of the story, but with an agenda attached to it. You matter, you're special, you're a part of the story, and so you must do this thing that serves this particular end, which is in service to some very harmful forces.
Yeah. You know, but when you talk about constitutional transformation, you referred to Mohan Jackson and the two spheres. One of the things I wondered is that in the current structures, for instance, if you're making claims, it seems that the framework for making claims is situated within the whiteness of the settler colonial structure.
Yes.
So how does one retain the transformative nature of the commitments of Tetiriti while having to negotiate a colonial structure based upon its rules of whiteness?
You know, I think, you know, so the critique of the Waitangi Tribunal is just as important as the products of the Waitangi Tribunal. And there is an increasing voice that critiques the Waitangi Tribunal as a construct of the government. And it's, you know, it's really interesting because when the Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was drafted by Mohan Jackson and many others, you know, wonderful Indigenous leaders, and that too exists within this, you know, kind of broader colonial framework of the United Nations, a collection of colonizing nations as well. But that was also drafted by some brilliant Indigenous minds. And when that was first put through to the General Assembly, the groups who did not vote in its favour were, of course, the nations, the most dominant colonial nations, were New Zealand, Australia, USA, Canada, I think Mexico, were the ones who refused to sign on to it. And when New Zealand refused to sign on to it, they actually utilised Te Tiriti as the reason to not ratify the Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And they positioned that actually to do so would disrespect Te Tiriti. And I found that that's really interesting to see, to watch them actually weaponise Te Tiriti against Indigenous rights in an Aotearoa context, even for a document that is drafted by Māori, you know, who Māori have participated in the drafting of it. So, yeah, I found that to be an interesting demonstration of some of the problematic approaches to Te Tiriti by our Crown, because, you know, one of those factors is that actually the Waitangi Tribunal obviously is limited to breaches from 1840 onwards within a particular context of the articles of Te Tiriti. It's crafted within a colonial context, as you point out. The ultimate authority on the matter is the Crown, and we see that coming through again and again, where even when the Waitangi Tribunal delivers findings like Te Paparahi o Te Raki that Te Tiriti was not a treaty of cession, it's still ultimately up to the Crown whether or not they do anything with those recommendations. And there have been multiple recommendations that have not been taken up by the Crown. There are other aspects to it, such as, you know, the limitations that are placed upon settlements, the inability to be able to claim land that has been privatised, even though it was stolen land. Once it's been privatised, it can't be included in a settlement. And you know, even the settlement process in and of itself is a painful and divisive process. It is under-resourced for people to be able to gather this information. It's deeply traumatic information that you're then placing before a group, which is then contested by the Crown as well, who are basically gaslighting you about your own experience of colonisation. And this process, which is completely toothless, has been put forward as the reason why we should not why we don't need to and should not ratify the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, even though historically it has been Māori who, as I say, have dragged the crown to the table to actually honour Te Tiriti in the first place, and that is an ongoing issue. So yeah, it's an issue that, you know, the Waitangi Tribunal and the current placement, constitutional placement of Te Tiriti o Waitangi sits within this broader framework of Crown authority, which in and of itself is a violation of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the level of authority claimed by the current government. You know, and it's almost absurd. Te tiriti matters enough for you upon which to base a government, but it doesn't matter enough to be enforceable by that same government. You know? So just this picking and choosing, the perversity of the picking and choosing about when it matters and when it doesn't matter. If it doesn't matter enough to be enforceable, then how do you base your entire government upon it? Your very presence is based upon it, but it's not enforceable and doesn't matter enough to be able to claim back privatised land and doesn't matter enough to be able to actually apply the findings of the tribunal. So, you know, I think it's always going to be problematic whilst it's still applied within this larger assumption of Crown authority, which in and of itself is a violation.
And the assertion of legitimacy in that sense reproduces the whiteness of the Crown.
Yes, yes it does.
You know, Tina, as we move toward wrapping up, I'm really drawn toward a few things. One, you said about how important it is to maintain the strength of dissent amidst the shiny the seduction of co-option. You know, do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Sure. So, you know, I think as we have become more articulate in speaking to justice, and a part of this is tied into a global movement of justice, the civil rights movement, and the Black Lives Matter movement, the Indigenous rights movement, the climate rights movement, migrant rights. As we have become more articulate in this space, you can see that Crown forces, white supremacist governments, and the vast majority of governments are white supremacist governments, have become more sophisticated in positioning themselves in a way that appears beneficent, that appears to be righteous, but actually doesn't really do that much at all. So it's there's these practices of performativity and making grand gestures, but then not actually resourcing it properly, not actually putting the power relationships in behind it to make it eventuate into anything at all, but making grand gestures, large performative displays that they will then ride for political capital for a long time, whilst they fail to actually support it to effect any change. So that has become a very sophisticated tactic. An excellent demonstration of that was the recent statement by the Vatican in response to the long-standing call of Indigenous peoples to rescind the doctrine of discovery. And what they put out was a statement of repudiation, and that repudiation completely failed to take responsibility and step into accountability for what the Catholic Church did and the Vatican is responsible for. Now, they wrote the underlying papal laws which codified racism and an entitlement to enslave people and dispossess them of their lands. They've never rescinded those laws. They still have not rescinded those laws. Actually, sorry, I tell a lie. One of those laws was effectively rescinded in the 1530s for 1 year, and then they revoked that rescindment and put it back in place.
Which law was this? Do you remember?
So they had looked at, there was a there's a papal law called Sublimis Dei, and Sublimis Dei says God is sublime, and the previous papal laws, and it references, it was discussing inter se terra, omnis pontifex, previous papal laws which denied Indigenous peoples their humanity should be cast out, and you are not able to punish or harm Indigenous peoples who refuse to convert to Christianity. And then exactly 1 year later, because of the pushback from the conquistadors and comentieros, which are the people who established farms, essentially settler farmers, who were previously conquistadors, had pushed back on that and said, okay, hang on, we've established ourselves on these nations. We've already enslaved them. You're telling us we can't do that now. And so, it only took a year for the Vatican to then revoke that rescindment, that single rescindment, with a new papal law called Non Indecens Videtur, which says essentially it should not be indecent to carry out the acts of colonialism as well. So they have actually proven that they can do it. For 1 year, they were able to do it, but from that point on, they haven't. Yeah, so they've put it in place, and those papal laws are still in place now, as well. And many of them are seen, for instance, inter se terra is seen as the basis of international law, one of the founding examples of international law. The Junta de Valladolid, the Valladolid debates, legal debates, are seen as the basis of treaty law. And so these things became foundational in our international relations and how we constructed ideas of how you treat each other transnationally as well. So they're still in place. Yeah, they're still in place.
The global
now.
Foundations of violence.
Yes, absolutely. They're still in place now with of course, and all of this started, I remember at the beginning, I often used to say, what gives these people the right?
Yeah.
Where do you believe you get the right to enslave? Where do you believe you get the right as somebody who owns a corporation in Canada? Where do you believe that you get the right to send somebody here halfway around the world to drill my seabed and to forever change my landscape and to impact upon mine and my children's and my grandchildren's worlds like this? Where do you believe you get that entitlement? And so it was that question that really sent me on this quest of learning about the doctrine of discovery, because that was literally what created these entitlements, not just in a legal setting, but it created a social psyche of entitlement that has endured throughout time and is now replete throughout modern society.
And in that recognition itself, I see so much possibilities for building solidarities. Yes. You know, as hearing you articulate this, Tina, as a Bengali, I'm thinking about how doctrine of discovery shaped my experiences and the experiences of my ancestors, and the colonial processes that really established, if you will, the capitalist foundation of East India Company, the first global corporation, right?
Yes.
So the question then is, particularly for migrants of color who have come to Aotearoa, bringing with them these experiences of the effects of the colonial violence rooted in doctrine of discovery.
Absolutely.
What are the openings for crafting solidarities with Ngata Whenua and really anchoring in Petiliti?
You know, I think the foundations of relationships of solidarity come with clearly understanding your intersections and your divergences. You know, so you need to know your story. You need to listen and wānanga with people about their story so that you can see, actually, This is where our stories intersect, and otherwise you'll be sold another story. You'll be sold another story by people who have a particular agenda. And so the story of the doctrine of discovery and how it has driven people, how it has really shaped the movement of people around the globe, the construction of borders, the construction of economic zones, and the role that it has played in driving people to Aotearoa as well. The economic circumstances that have been created through the doctrine of discovery that have driven people here. And who gets to move and what they're called when they're moved and how they're framed when they move, and the opportunities that are created or denied to them when they arrive here off the basis of the society that has been created here. And where did that society come from, and what was it like in your land as well? And so I think when we understand that story and the background and how there isn't anybody in this planet that gets to escape that story. It has shaped and continues to shape all of our existences. Then I think we will have better foundations for solidarity. Because to an extent, a part of the issue is sometimes we stray into each other's lanes because we don't know the lanes, because we don't know the story. I want to be the best ally I can be to you, Mohan, which means that I have to learn your story. And if I am to enjoy the benefits of having great allies, then they need to understand my story as well.
You have to learn to listen to your story.
Yeah, and our shared story, and also where it diverges as well.
Yes.
Because we don't want to be exercising entitlement into each other's spaces. We're replicating the problem when we do that. So we need to understand, where does that divergence happen and where does our story come together? And the Indigenous movement alone is a hugely powerful movement. It's the second in size only to the LGBTQI movement. The migrant movement, also hugely powerful movement. If we can establish solidarity upon those grounds, I really don't think there's anything that can stand in our way of moving towards these ideas of global justice. People think, if we don't share this story, people will sell you this idea, and I see it happening now. They'll sell you this idea that Māori don't want anybody else on this land. We only want Māori on this land.
Divide and rule.
Divide and rule.
Divide and rule.
Which is, and they'll say that, when we're fighting for tiriti justice, that we're fighting to kick everybody else out. No, Te Tiriti is about creating a home for everybody. It's the standards for what that looks like is what tiriti justice is. So, I think, when we can tell that story in its fullness, and it's important, we have to be really clear in these narratives. It's so important. That's the basis upon which systems of power legitimize themselves. Our narratives, really, when it comes down to it, our narratives, especially within democracies. So, telling these stories and sharing these stories and sitting in discussion as we are today is incredibly important.
So the last big picture question, Tina, we have grappled with some really powerful issues, and to me, these issues point toward perhaps one of the most salient issues of our times, which is climate justice and climate colonialism.
Yes.
When you think about the kinds of effects we are seeing here in the Pacific,
right,
with islands going underwater, livelihoods destroyed, it seems that this is also a time where there needs to be a powerful challenge put against the kinds of forces of extractive neoliberal capitalism that have gone to an extreme and continue to perpetuate these extractive practices. So what do indigenous movements offer us in challenging climate colonialism?
Sure. So when you look back at, the forces at play today, which really drive climate colonialism and climate crime. They haven't actually been around for that long. They've been around since really the advent of the Industrial Revolution, some 300 years. And I compare that to indigenous models of governance, of care for the land and care for waterways. Thousands of years old. Look at our relations over in Australia. They've lived in and with and beside and around, these, what people would consider to be, what some people would consider to be hostile environmental conditions of extreme heat or whatever. They've managed to live in these systems but also nurture well-being within these systems for over 10,000 years.
Kia ora.
You know, at least 1,000 years. I mean, going by our oral traditions, we're also descendants of Pānia, we're also descendants of Maori, we're also descendants of ancestors that have come out of these soils. And so in honouring and recognising that we have oral traditions that say that we have already been here, it's much longer than 1,000 years. Even if we were to just look at our ancestors who came here on the waka, there's, 1,000 years or so of looking after waterways, of keeping our systems abundant, and so, and ways of economy, systems of jurisprudence, ways of political organisation and social organisation that were commensurate with an abundant environment. And so I look at the period of time that we have held on to those spaces, and in just 300 short years, actually, if we're talking about Aotearoa, that's 1,000 years compared to 180 years of harm. And that says to me, if you can do that in 180 years, we can undo it. We can undo it, because look at the period of time that we held abundant systems for. If you look at that at a global scale, 10,000 years or more, tens of thousands of years that indigenous peoples have looked after these spaces of abundance. You look at the fact that 80% of the world's biodiversity is held within indigenous managed lands. You have a look at indigenous managed forests, which sequester 300 times more carbon than other forests. And you think, wow, look at the ecological potential of land back. If that's what we can do when we currently survive on less than 1/5 of our traditional territories, we've been able to sequester significantly more carbon in those indigenous managed territories. We've been able to hold on to significantly more biodiversity in those spaces, significantly more social well-being when we are able to look after our own systems in those spaces. What is the potential of land back within that context as well? So it holds great potential. That said, we cannot just look to indigenous peoples for solutions without understanding that we have to also stand in solidarity for them, for the barriers that stand in our own way to potentiating those solutions. Don't just knock on my door because you want to learn how to look after a forest if you're not willing to stand with me when I'm fighting for my language, because my language is connected to that forest. My language is that forest, it comes out of that forest. We have an onomatopoeic language that mimics the sounds of the spaces that we live in, and that holds vital information in how we look after these places. So if you're not going to stand by me whilst I'm fighting for the rights of maternal health care for Indigenous women, the rights of our people and families within the justice sector, the rights for me to hold on to my children and not have them taken out of my home, then don't come and knock on my door and ask for me to give you information on how to look after that plant over there. It has to be connected, because that is the point of anti-colonialism, is to reconnect the fundamentally disconnected practice of imperialism and colonialism.
So beautiful.
Thank you.
Tina. And thank you for offering us that hope and crafting really a vision for hope in terms of how, the kinds of things we're going to talk about, say, as Maori migrant solidarities or anti-racist strategies actually are connected to broader projects of anti-colonialism, anti-capitalism, climate justice.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to share these narratives and to shift the narratives. Because at the end of the day, if the colonizer is going to do what they're going to do, then they don't get to do it and call themselves the good guy with the white hat. Right? So sharing these narratives in and of itself is beneficial. So thank you for the invite.
Thank you so much.